Hello, my name is Craig Warren Smith. I've been advisor to the Republic of Indonesia for 15 years, focused always on the question of how to close Indonesia's digital divide. Digital divide refers to the matter in which, as the digital economy spreads to all Indonesians, the nation could move towards a more equitable outcome in which the benefits of digitalization are spread fairly across all socioeconomic tiers. That's been my issue. And now we're talking about big data. And it turns out that big data is a huge factor in closing digital divide. Before I explain the implications of a big data policy for Indonesia, I'm going to talk about a concept that is rooted in the Greek tradition called Promethean fire. Zeus held fire and controlled fire, but Prometheus stole it from him and gave it to humanity for better or worse. The internet is like the Promethean fire, and big data specifically is like Promethean fire. It can make everything better or it can make everything worse. It has a power like the power of the gods in Zeus's time, and it gives humans a power that they never had before to make things really, really bad or really, really good. Now, this gives some indication of the implications of a policy towards big data for Indonesia at this time, because we've seen, as an outgrowth of the COVID phenomenon, the pandemic here in Indonesia, that the internet's economy, the digital economy, has accelerated rapidly, creating wealth concentrated in the top 10% of the market and removing wealth in the bottom 30%. We've seen that 6 million people have been thrust into poverty in Indonesia just within this year of 2020. And according to the World Bank, in 2021, another 6 or 7 near poor Indonesians could move into the ranks of the fully poor, and that as an outcome of that phenomenon, we could see for the first time in a century the outbreak of a hunger crisis in Indonesia, as if this problem isn't fixed. So we're seeing the inequality of wealth, as an outcome that is baked into the spread of Indonesia's digital economy, just as it is baked into the spread of the global digital economy. The question now for us at this AI Big Data Conference is whether we as stakeholders in Indonesia could work together to control this Promethean fire, this big data, so that it is helpful and not harmful to the mass Indonesian population. As we address this issue, we have to take note of a phenomenon called the winner-takes-all factor that seems to be dominant in the digital economy, in which those who already have data or who already control data control more of it until they shape the economics, the jobs, and even the behavior of those who are not in a position to control data. And the big tech companies and their allies in governments are able then to direct the flow of data in a way that gives them disproportionate control, unequitable control, to the point that we're talking about the shaping of a society that breaks social contract. Social contract is the most powerful idea in political philosophy, It is relevant to our own time, and it suggests that as wealth becomes increasingly concentrated at the top of the Indonesian market as a result of the spreading digital economy, that we are going to be seeing social unrest, perhaps even the prospect of a revolution in which the laws of the Republic of Indonesia cannot be fully implemented because the lack of unfairness that is in the system. So as we look at the question of what to do with data and whether a policy of big data may be needed, I want to suggest that there's a danger that if we don't get it right, and if we don't get it right quickly, we are going to see this dystopian outcome affecting Indonesia's digital economy and ultimately affecting the shaping of and the survival of the overall Republic of Indonesia and its democratic system. Now, having given you that kind of dismal prelude to my talk, I want to explain the good news. The good news is that conditions exist here in Indonesia in 2020 for flipping the digital economy and flipping the role of data so that it has the effect of enabling increasing equity rather than inequity, and rather than leading us to the winner-take-all outcome under business as usual, under the current framework that is built into Indonesia's digital economy, it could work in reverse order. We could consider how to shape the architecture of the digital economy so that the flow of big data moves not from the top to the bottom, but from the bottom to the top, and that it essentially leads us to a strong, stable middle class, uplifts people from the lower middle class into a strong middle class, and it does that in rather short time, because as we anticipate the exponential rise of data, that data becomes directed towards the benefit of all Indonesians. So I'm suggesting that 3 factors are already in place to enable this historic flipping of the digital economy, this historic flipping of the role of data as a factor in equity rather than inequity. The first of these 3 factors is what could be called political will. In 2020, as we get hopefully to the end of the pandemic, to the COVID era, we notice that the attention of the Republic of Indonesia is moving away from a notion like Industry 4.0, for example, and towards the question of how to accelerate equity, reverse inequity in the national economy. And you can see this step by step in the policies and procedures enacted by the Republic of Indonesia just this year as the pandemic has deepened. The second factor that I see as extremely positive, moving in the right direction, is that the Ministry on Research and Technology has activated Indonesian AI strategy. This strategy looks beyond the focus in Jakarta last year, focused on this concept of Industry 4.0, in which the industrial sector activates emergent technologies, including AI, to support the competitiveness of the big businesses that lie along Sudirman Avenue. The way in which Klaus Schwab, the author from the World Economic Forum of Industry 4.0, would imagine Industry 4.0 in Indonesia is that it would be focusing purely on accelerating the wealth, reducing the level of employment, and concentrating ownership at the very top of the market. So as an alternative to that, we have a new national AI strategy that looks to big data, not for competitiveness of industry alone, but to address critical problems of the nation, such as public health at a time of pandemics, such as addressing core issues of fisheries and agriculture and food security and so forth. So there's a shift towards artificial intelligence and the whole basket of other emergent technologies to support, from supporting industry to supporting the nature at large. But so far, this only puts Indonesia at the doorstep of an additional factor that is needed. That right now, then, the challenge is to couple the one data policy, the national AI strategy, with another kind of policy that explicitly focuses on the role of big data in reducing inequality. That is, what is needed now is an AI policy that reduces digital divide, that produces equity in the digital economy. Now, as it turns out, we have two additional factors here that contribute to this positive outcome. The first factor is one that has not been introduced to Indonesia yet, but it is incredibly auspicious and incredibly needed. An idea, not a technology, simply an idea, a concept. The idea is authored by a very prominent computer scientist at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. His name is Alex Pentland, nicknamed Sandy Pentland. He has a notion called New Deal on Data. This notion, which he formulated in 2014, suggests that it's possible to redistribute data so that it moves from the bottom up rather than the top down. New Deal on Data is a way of restoring social contract, not undermining social contract, because it's rooted in communities, in civil society, and it's tied to a notion called data cooperatives. It's tied to fintech solutions and so forth. But let's hear from Professor Pentland himself, and he'll explain New Deal on Data to you.
The way to think about the New Deal on data is the following, is suddenly in our lives we have data about everything, typically from cell phones, credit cards, other sort of digital media. And it's now this sort of new oil of the economy. It's a new type of means of production, like money or land. But it's only held by a few hands. It's only held by some big corporations. And people worry that now it's as if there was only one bank, and it wasn't a government bank, it was just some outside person who owned the bank. So some outside person now owns your data. So the New Deal on Data is giving ownership rights back to citizens, just as citizens have the right to own their own labor and own their own money and own their own land. And it's not quite like any of those other three means of production because it's not as exchangeable and fungible as money. And so there needs to be a way for citizens to capture their data and make use of it. A thing that's a little difficult, but actually in a developing nation works out quite well, is that just having your data doesn't do you very much because what can you do with it? On the other hand, if you had everybody in the community had a cooperative where they could together pool their data, turns out the software for doing that is very simple. You might need some regulatory reform, but typically not even new laws. And now the community can have a picture of where do people work? Where do they shop? Who comes to the community? Those sorts of things. Where do they spend money? Spend money on what? And all this comes off of this automatically generated data that comes from our phones and other medium. You don't have to do anything extra. You just have to capture it. And suddenly the community can be much more powerful about figuring out what to do. Where should they invest? Where should the buses go? They can ask the government to have the appropriate connections for the buses, for instance, or point out to the government that they're not getting the health care that they need, and so forth. And you can't do that as a community unless you have the data, unless you know the facts. And so the New Deal on data is about empowering communities to know themselves and be able to advocate for themselves about having better investment, better health, better connection to the rest of the nation. And of course, that's good for the whole nation. I am very interested in seeing this happen and working perhaps with yourself and Benjamin if we can find the right sort of support for students and things like that to actually get people engaged on the project.
Thank you, Sandy. So the question then is, well, that sounds great, but can it relate to a big, large, messy, developing nation such as Indonesia with 285 million people? So far, Sandy Pentland has trialed New Deal on data in Switzerland, Malaysia, a few other places in the world, but only in a partial way. Could it be possible that New Deal on data, Sandy Pentland's view, could actually take root in a far off place halfway around the world from MIT called Indonesia? I'm suggesting that yes, because of Ilham Habibi and his work here in planting the seeds for a more equitable digital economy, the conditions have been created for taking the New Deal on data and turning it into a new kind of stakeholder alignment called meaningful broadband. Meaningful broadband. I'd like Ilham, my dear friend and partner here in Indonesia, to explain this concept to you.
I'd like to say a few words about meaningful broadband. Meaningful broadband is a concept that has been developed by Digital Divide Institute under the leadership of Professor Craig Smith. I've been working with Craig for many, many years, and one of the outcomes is a collaboration between DDI, Digital Divide Institute, where I am a member, with One Thickness, which is the National ICT Council, and Indonesian government entity more on the advisory side, which I have been leading since 2014. So both of us, basically DDI and One Thickness, have been collaborating on meaningful broadband since many years, and we've established working groups called MBWG. But before I continue about the work and the results that we have achieved throughout the years, I'd like to perhaps take this opportunity to define a little bit more the word meaningful broadband itself. So meaningful is basically subdivided into three aspects. One would be usable, this would be affordable, and the last one is empowering. So basically usable is quite clear. I mean, it's ease of use. And affordable also clear. It's from an economic perspective, financial inclusion is part of this. The last part is probably the most difficult one to basically deliver broadband in a way that is empowering. So basically enhance quality of life and basically bring progress to people and country, and at the same time also do it in an open way so people can participate. It's a participatory form of innovation that can be basically contributed by making broadband meaningful. So everybody participated in this, government sector, from the private sector, from state-owned companies, and also academia, and lastly, of course, all the NGOs, the professional organizations, in order to basically learn together and develop together and make sure that there's no comment left out and in the design and implementation of what was the result of the meaningful broadband working groups. And I think we're definitely on the right path. Yes, there's still a lot of challenges ahead of us. I mean, particularly now, I mean, all of us are still basically, as I speak, in the so-called COVID pandemic era, where we haven't seen an extreme form of what we probably face in the future. Many areas have only been accessible to us, including learning or health services, through online means because of the situation and condition. This is not going to be the future. The future is going to be sort of like a blendedness. There will be a substantial portion of online, but there's still going to be some not small portion of offline. We want nobody left out in this process, so to make sure that the new normal is not only new, but it's a better normal. We want to have a better future, a higher quality of life for as many people as possible in this world. It's for all of us. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the next opportunity. Bye.
Thank you, Ilham. So, as he indicated, the effect of 15 years of Ilham's leadership in Indonesia on the subject of technology policy has resulted in something called the Meaningful Broadband Working Group. So this group is now composed of members who are represented here on the screen in about 30 different stakeholder institutions. So as you scrutinize this list, please understand that this is the most comprehensive coalition of ICT stakeholders ever gathered in Indonesia. And it includes not merely the typical tech-related ministries such as Kominfo or the Ministry of Research and Technology, but a much broader scope of institutions that all come together in the shaping of the Indonesian digital economy. It represents a structure that is intergovernmental, including the Office of the President, Istana Negara, and various consolidated ministries such as Bappenas and Ministry of Finance, but it also includes line ministries of education, health, and agriculture, and so forth. But it also includes state-owned enterprises, the big tech sector internationally represented here in Indonesia. They're all represented in this structure. So the aim is to produce change policies and practices across this vast interwoven structure into a kind of ecosystem that would allow bottom-up data to flow from the very grassroots of this society. Now, to illustrate what we may mean by this, to create a kind of quick win for this big data policy, I want to move to the topic of one particular sector that is immediately relevant to this bottom-up big data approach, and that is food and agriculture. As you can see in the slide that's now in front of the screen, that there's a certain clustering of these stakeholder institutions that would be particularly involved in aggregating various policies and practices to allow a flipping of data to move from the bottom to the top. For example, you'll see on this list the Ministry of Cooperatives. One of Sandy Pentland's core ideas is to activate a topic called data cooperatives that could be included as a kind of, together with agricultural cooperatives and other kind of cooperatives. This represents data aggregation at the very bottom of the market, so that individuals and companies could come together in every village and in every district and regency in order to formulate how they wish their data to be managed and monetized on a bottom-up basis. So the idea here is not necessarily to help each individual monetize the data that comes, say, from Telkomsel or something, but to enter into discussions at the community level about how a community could activate data in such a way as to support the values and the sustainable development agendas and so forth of these local communities. So we might have a major innovation introduced through this framework called data cooperatives. And as you look across these various domains here on this mandala chart, you would see also that there's technological innovations. For example, the satellite to be activated by Bhakti, and perhaps, who knows, we might have Starlink or other international sources of satellites at one point operating in low orbit in order to provide another means for data flow based on aerial surveillance tied to food and agriculture. And we might also have innovations in finance, such as, for example, the concept of smart subsidy, in which the Ministry of Finance in Jakarta would consider how to alter the forms of subsidy to encourage bottom-up data flow. For example, the village fund that receives a certain amount of money every year as subsidy per village, that possibly could be restructured so that it incorporates incentives to move each village into optimal activation in terms of how each village begins to distribute its own data in support of the wishes of each village, and how that village then integrates into district and regency interaction, so that we're really building data ecosystems from the bottom up. Now, how this might work in the area of food and agriculture is a topic to be unpacked and unfolded in combination with international agencies such as the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, represented here as well, to incorporate international best practice into this kind of discussion. So through this kind of topic, we can begin to formulate innovations in 4 domains: in technology, in finance, into public policy, and in management, all brought together into an ecosystem that would create a new anchor for the digital economy in Indonesia, so that data begins to become intensified and integrated in support of the interests in the so-called informal economy, which by definition has lacked data in the past. So we hope to begin a process that would enable bottom-up data flow to be activated as the digital economy expands and spreads to the nation at large. If you're interested in this development, if you wish to contribute solutions to this approach to bottom-up data policy, you might look at the websites that are indicated on the screen. Wantignus, which is the government entity overseen by Ilham Habibi, and Digital Divide Institute, which is a kind of think tank that will formulate international, worldwide innovations tied to meaningful broadband that will be then integrated into Indonesia as the first nation to fully activate this bottom-up data approach articulated by Sandy Pentland. Thank you very much for your attention and best wishes to you.